Welcome to another edition of Economic Forum, where we discuss various issues affecting our economy in Zimbabwe. For many years, there have been disputes about ownership of property, be they family disputes, organizational disputes, including religious organizations, to the extent of fist fighting. So today, we've decided to discuss property rights, and we've invited into the studio a property rights advocate, Rejoice NGWENYA. Rejoice, you have written several books and made several presentations and done a lot of research about property rights in Zimbabwe. We welcome you to Economic Forum.
Thank you very much, John.
Yes.
I love to be here.
To begin with, can you define property rights in terms of our traditional, in terms of our religious, and other settings?
Great. Now, John, a right is a privilege. When we say you have a right over something or right to something, you have a privilege. That privilege might be exclusive, it might be individual, it might be collective, it might be communal, but it's a privilege. But as soon as you say a right, it must be backed by a legal instrument. This is why you discover that most constitutions, in fact even statutes for countries that don't have constitutions, property rights are legitimized and legalized through some statutes. So I would say that a property right is a legal privilege towards a right, a property. And of course, you know that property can either be fixed, can it be mobile, it can be intellectual. So I suppose we're going to get into those details.
Let's go straight into that. You know, back in the rural areas, there's a way of saying, this is my property. And in the urban areas, there's emphasis on title deeds and other documents and so forth. And in churches, the same thing. To the extent that when people are not aware of that, there have been situations where after so many years, people only discover that a particular institution or a particular church was registered in the name of an individual and not of an institution.
Traditionally, we all know that as Africans, we've owned things. Plowing instruments, we have owned cattle, goats, and chickens. And we have always said, this is our property, right? Including the little space that you get in your village, dwelling. It is your property. But then the difference, John, is that the new enlightenment is that that property technically could not quite be yours because it is not registered in a way. Remember I said, when I was defining property rights, I was saying it must be a legitimate and a legalized privilege. It is your property in the rural areas, and as you know that, the Constitution is very clear that all land in rural areas, it is not owned by chiefs. No, it's a myth. It is owned by the government. The chiefs are just the stewards and the custodians. But you may be pleased to know that things like cattle and goats, and so can be registered. That's why we have something called rupao, because that gives you some kind of legitimate privilege because it's now registered in your name. But otherwise, traditionally, we've always known that, apapamba paniki, muzigabani, although it is not written, it's assumed. And that is the danger that we advocates of property, we want to try and move out so that we minimize disputes.
And does that affect those businesses of ours out there in the rural areas, those shops and so forth? What type of title do they have?
Of course, you remember the term growth points that came, I think, it evolved later in the early part of our independence. Growth points under the Town Planning Act, regional planning laws, can be legitimized. You can actually have title deeds and growth points. Why? Because it is business. Business people do understand the issue of property rights. But it's not all places in rural areas that are called growth points. So that village shop that is across the village, it just falls under.
It may not be at a growth point, but just at your village. That's the one that I'm talking about.
It's basically because a growth point is designated by law. Yes. That is the growth point. But that village shop that you have, Pachigayo and so forth, is obviously also very vulnerable to abuse because there's no legitimate registration of the property. It also falls under the purview of the chieftainship and government ownership. And that, to me, does not enhance wealth. We're going to talk about how property enhances wealth, but that is a misnomer that should be corrected.
And the other type of property is intellectual property, because you can have property that you, like you gave reference to Ikuba, you gave reference to Umuzi and others. But there's also intellectual property. You yourself have been writing books, other people do research and so forth. Things that you may not necessarily hold,
True.
but they are coming from your brains, they are coming from your talent, and nowadays that is being seriously recognized, including your knowledge.
Absolutely.
Yes. So how do you deal with that?
You remember, John, the single records that we used to play in the 60s and 70s and the LPs? If you reread them now, we are going to see a term saying copyrights. So we have always known that intellectual property, even if it's entertainment, it is copywritten. That is why it was important for musical artists to sign contracts with the recording companies, because they were trying to protect that intellectual property. The unfortunate bit is that it was not benefiting them. Of course, we talk about royalties, but intellectual property has something to do with something that is intangible, an asset that is intangible, works of art. The writings, we used to read a lot of books from A.C. Moyo, Father Ribeiro, Papa Makalisa, and so forth. So that is intellectual property that is then registered under the ISBN. But then again, we also want to enlighten ourselves that sometimes if you don't register that intellectual property, somebody cleverer than you can come and take your work.
Yes.
Then you can hear your record being played somewhere in Kenya. You can't claim it because perhaps the guy Diamond has reissued it. So that's very critical to understand.
Very important indeed, because that is arising nowadays with some musicians, where families are complaining that their late beloved ones' music is being played and they're not getting anything.
Absolutely.
But we'll return to that
Absolutely.
in the second segment. We'll return in the second segment of Economic Forum. And please note that if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so on the numbers that are showing on the screen. And also, you can watch some of the past episodes that we've had on YouTube. Our YouTube channel is Economic Forum Zimbabwe. So join us in the second segment. Welcome to the second segment of Economic Forum, where today we are discussing property rights. What rights do people have? How can they protect them? And we've got Rejoice NGWENYA, who is a property rights advocate. But I have to mention again, in terms of the law, that Rejoice, you were involved in the writing of the 2009 Constitution. That was the Constitutional Commission, and we were also part of COPAC. So we hope that as you explain these things, you are going also to be explaining them from an informed point of view. Now, what I want to talk about here really is the implication of all those definitions of property that you mentioned in the second segment. Particularly, what does the Constitution say, first and foremost, before we go to the creation of wealth and reduction of poverty?
Right. See, the Constitution, as we define it now, is very clear on what property rights mean to citizens. Because it's citizens that talked about it. This is why you find that the Bill of Rights talks about the right to property. And it's very clear that when you have a right to property, nobody, including the state, can deprive you of that right, because it's part of the Bill of Rights. Now, then it crosses over now to what we can call commercial property. Now we're talking about farmlands. And this is where you know the history that, there's the issue that now the farmlands are owned by, the state. But it's very important, John, for us to understand that property rights are protected by the Constitution. They are fundamentally part of our rights, matrix. And if you are going to be violating property rights, you have to then face the law, because it is the law that defines them.
So, having said that, Rejoice, let's now go and talk about the importance of property right in wealth creation, because this is Economic Forum and we're talking about wealth creation and reduction of poverty. You don't want a situation where we know that your grandfather or your father was rich and we ask ourselves questions, why Rejoice is now a pauper, why is he now sleeping on the street, yet we know that he comes from that rich background.
Beautiful. Most of the times that if you go to rural areas, you'll see a lot of cattle, in the plains, Mbani. And if you take time to spend time just before sunset, when these boys are taking the cattle to the pens, and you follow those boys home, sometimes you find abject poverty in the family. People complaining that we are poor. You are not poor, because cattle are not objects. They are not souvenirs. They are not there for display. They are there to enrich you. This is
in various ways.
Exactly, in various ways. I mean, you know that when you are playing lobola, the first thing the parents of the bride ask is cattle. So they are very important in the matrix of wealth creation, but they have to be registered. Why? Because first of all, it legitimizes your ownership.
Registered where?
Well, we know that in terms of the stock, laws. That's why you find cattle with horns on it. We call them upao.
Upao and mchiso.
Especially mchiso. It's a way of acknowledging. This is why stock theft is considered a grave crime in Zimbabwe, because you have deprived an individual of his property. But it becomes very difficult to prove if that stock does not have, mchiso.
So you are saying that that upao or that mark is actually registered at law?
It's registered at law. The reason why we then bring in the function of wealth is because it has a marketable, character. It's exchangeable on the market. That's why we take our cattle to the market. The market is an open place for competition where people come and bid. So if you hear a family saying, we cannot send our child to university because we are poor, and they are sitting on 50 heads of cattle, then they need to be enlightened that no, those heads of cattle are not souvenirs. They are part of the matrix of wealth.
Is this something that you are already doing yourself as an advocate of property rights through your different organizations to actually inform people about the value of what they have, the value of their land, the value of their property?
In fact, now that you mention it, I think this is the responsibility of the farmers' unions who are confronted by the so-called widespread and prevalent poverty in rural areas. And sometimes our poverty is inferred, it's psychological. So it is their responsibility to explain to the citizens that whenever you have something that you call your own, get it registered, get it insured. John, insurance is very important. For instance, we're in the rainy season. Do you know that a single bolt of lightning can destroy your entire herd of cattle? So if it is not insured, then you've lost everything. It doesn't cost much to insure. So we have a lot of work as advocates to inform our rural citizens that each and everything that we have, whether it is a scotch cut, whether it is a hoe, an ox-drawn plow, it must be listed as part of the matrix of your property ownership. Imagine a woman who has been working with her husband for 50, 60 years, and the husband dies, and the babamninis, we call them the vultures of property, always hovering. They come and take the scotch cut, auntie, they take the plates, and so forth. It completely destroys the wealth structure of the family. So those things must not only be registered with anybody. You can write a list, go to a lawyer. There are NGOs like Legal Resources Foundation that can do that for you. And also for the people that take farming seriously in rural areas, your stock should be insured, including those properties that you have in your fields as your crops. They must be insured.
Is it possible?
It is possible.
You use some of it to insure the others.
Of course, so that you don't lose. Because if you lose 10 cattle through disease, John, or through theft, then you've lost your wealth. So this is why we are saying we are the enlightened generation, the generation that is speaking to citizens to say, move over from the feudal times and get into property registration.
Very interesting and very informative.
Right.
That's Rejoice NGWENYA, who is our guest today. He's talking about property rights, the importance of property rights in families, in organizations, and including in religious organizations where there have been disputes. And he has just been explaining how property rights can actually enhance your wealth in different areas. So it's very, very important to understand the value of the things that you have. So join us in the third and final segment of Economic Forum. Welcome to the third and final segment of Economic Forum, where we are discussing property rights. We have been discussing, Rejoice NGWENYA, about the implications of property rights after you defined them in various ways. But let's look at some of these properties that are termed informal. If you could just explain to us why they're informal, for how long are they going to be informal? And we've seen some places being, bulldozed and after building some mansions, after building some supermarkets and so forth. Let's talk about property rights vis-a-vis these informal settlements.
To even call something informal is a misnomer. You remember the old days that we used to call children out of wedlock illegitimate and bastards, and that has been changed. So the word informal, this is why even under the doing business in Zimbabwe now, we have a new way of registering companies to make it simpler so that anybody who is running a business, who is buying and selling, the term informal market is not supposed to be applied in the current civilization. But then you then get to places like Hopley, Retreat, Kingsdale, and so forth, where cooperatives, take public, land from the government and then dish it out to individuals. So they remain informal.
How does that happen? That they take from the government?
Right. Some of my writings, I've called it polycracy. In other words, politics and bureaucracy, when they combine them, it's a deadly combination. This is politicking with people's lives. It is not acceptable that a cooperative. In fact, when we do this research, John, we are looking at it from the citizen's viewpoint. That the person who has paid $5,000 in Solomia must be protected because he has bought that property from a cooperative that is usually registered. So what the cooperative should do, it should now act as a land developer. They should then sign a development agreement with the local authority so that they can legitimize the infrastructure formation. But cooperatives tend to want to make quick money. They simply parcel out the land. This is where the term informal comes in, and it is not very good. It's not a good way of investing. So actually, most of those cooperatives are criminal syndicates. This is why it is easy for local authorities to use the law to say you have built an informal structure which does not conform to the Urban Councils Act. It does not conform to any building standards. So they've got a right to destroy it. But we want to change that mentality now, John. The imperative now is that the central government and local authorities should deal with the cooperative, not the individuals that have bought the land, right? Of course, it's naive to build a $60,000 house on land that will be accorded by the cooperative because it doesn't come under the Urban Councils Act. But what you have to do as an individual, understand first who owns the land.
Yes, I was coming to that, Rejoice, that what are you saying, you as advocates, before people spend thousands and thousands of dollars in investing in property that they won't have title deeds, that they won't have any valid document to indicate that it is truly theirs.
True. Yeah, in law we say buyer beware. So technically speaking, because remember the law acts on buyer beware,
okay.
Caveat emptor. It means that you are spending $5,000 giving it to a cooperative treasury. You have not proved, you have not gone out of the way to prove who owns the land. So it is your responsibility as a citizen to prove that this cooperative owns the land.
How do you do that?
Yes, it's very simple. First of all, you go to the local authority to say, this place that I am being allocated, who owns the place. The local authority will tell you who owns the place. We cannot hide behind ignorance. However, John, what we are saying is that 30% of the citizens that live in urban centers live in those kind of places. So it is now the responsibility of advocates like ourselves and local authorities to simplify. We call it regularization. It is now easier to simplify the laws to conform to the new norm. Because the new norm, John, is that people are very poor and people are desperate for accommodation. So that's the new norm. So it is imperative that local authorities and central government and conveyance lawyers sit down together and say, how do we make it easy for somebody who has bought 300 square meters in Kingsdale, in Norton, to legitimize the ownership of the land? It's very important. Because if we
How about starting the other way around? That it's legitimized first before people spend money.
That is the difficult side. In other words, you are saying to me, if I wanted to run a flea market in Bari, I have to go and register a company first. No, it's not going to happen that way. The new normal is that I just go to Dubai, I go to Joburg and buy my things and have a stand. So what then the local authorities should do is...
then have running battles with the authorities.
Which is not what's supposed to be happening. So it's now the responsibility. Now we are talking responsible governance, Johnny. We are saying 2 million citizens are already on informal land. They are already there. Never mind where they got it from. It is important for the laws to protect them by regularizing that. The local authorities are going to, and the Surveyor General will tell you, no, it's so difficult, we have to do that and draw the lines. It doesn't make any difference anymore. We have new systems like GPS, we have drone planes that can do that. So it can be simplified. We have simplified the ways that we have registered, we are registering companies now, right? So we must simplify the way that we register property.
But the route that you are describing only becomes dangerous if that particular place is earmarked for something. Or let's say it's near an airport, and the airport is going to be growing in that direction, or some dams are going to be expanded.
Or wetlands.
And so forth. So, but we are saying, yes, it can be regularized, but the best is to make sure that, first and foremost, these places are properly allocated.
I do understand that. That is the best way. But what did I say, John, about the new norm? The new norm is poverty, desperation, and of course criminal tendencies. We are going to get cooperatives going to the government and saying, the government owns 60,000 hectares in Heathcliff. Can we allocate stands? That is where the government said, before you do that, go to the local authorities. But we know that is not happening. Before you know it, there are 60,000 people who are occupying those plots. And those are the individuals, John, I'm saying, we are trying to protect. It is not their fault, because they have paid and gotten a receipt. They think it's ownership. It's not ownership, it's occupancy. We need to simplify the laws that accord them legal status over those properties.
And nowadays, even the local authorities do not allow developments to take place before most of these things are done that you are mentioning.
Of course, even local authorities themselves, John, even if they allocate you space, they are not going to... How many local authorities are servicing what they have sold to individuals? So it's the same thing. If you cannot service what you have allocated, then you cannot service what you have not allocated. What you do, equalize the law so that you make it easier for people to declare their wealth over those properties.
NGWENYA, thank you very much for coming on to Economic Forum.
I appreciate that, John.
If you would like to watch some of the episodes that we've had, you can do so on our YouTube channel, and that is on Economic Forum Zimbabwe. And also, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so on the numbers that are showing on your screen. So until next time, this is John Masogo.